When it comes to college basketball coaches, there is Dean Smith, and then there is everybody else. So if you know college basketball, Dean Smith coached at North Carolina for 36 years. He was the coach of the Tar Heels, and he took them to 11 Final Fours and 2 national championships, and he broke every single record. And more than that, he ran an incredibly clean program. He graduated 96% of his students. He integrated not just his basketball team in 1966, but really Southern athletics, something he started trying to do in '62 when he very first came to North Carolina. When he died in 2015, President Obama remembered giving him the Congressional Medal of Honor in 2013, and he talked about what a remarkable person Dean Smith was. He didn't just integrate that team, he integrated lunch counters and restaurants and neighborhoods in Chapel Hill, and he was for gay rights and women's rights. He spoke out against the death penalty, against nuclear proliferation. He was just not, let's just say, your average Southern coach, okay? And then there was this remarkable Carolina family. That's what he called it, the Carolina tree, which meant everybody he touched, every athlete, every student would go on to touch others. And in some ways, he kind of came by this honestly. Dean Smith was born in Emporia, Kansas. His father and mother both taught in Emporia Public Schools. His father integrated his high school basketball team that he coached in Emporia, Kansas in 1934, like 20 years before Brown versus Board, right? So this is the family he came from. And if you look up the kind of Carolina family and all the people that Dean Smith touched, you know, there's some really well-known people, and then there's like players who were good but not great, who nobody remembers, and then there's Michael Jordan. And when they recruited Michael Jordan to North Carolina, Michael Jordan was not Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan was 6'4", and he couldn't dribble to the left, but he told them that he would work harder than anybody ever did, and he did. And after Dean Smith died, Michael Jordan said, of anyone in my life, next to my parents, no one influenced me more. He wasn't just my coach, he was my friend, he was my mentor, he was a second father to me. That was Dean Smith. And among all the people who were touched by Dean Smith, then there was Roy Williams. Many of you know that name. Roy Williams grew up kind of in the mountains of North Carolina, rough family. His father was one of 13, his mother was one of 10. They didn't have much. His father drank. His father was a mean drunk. Roy Williams, in his autobiography, told the story about one day when his father, Roy was 14, went after his mother, and Roy got a bottle and pulled his dad off him, told him he'd kill him if he ever came back, right? I mean, it was a rough childhood. He was the first person kind of in his family to make it to college. He was a walk-on at North Carolina as a freshman under Dean Smith. And then as a sophomore, he said, can I sit in the stands and just take notes and learn how to be a coach from you? So he became something of like a student assistant, and then a few years later, he came back to North Carolina, and he was an assistant coach under Dean Smith for 10 years until 1998, he was called to be the coach of what? The Jayhawks, right? Where he coached for 15 years. Had one of the most successful runs as a Jayhawk coach, one of the highest winning records ever. And then when Dean Smith stepped down pretty suddenly, pulled in an assistant coach, but then they came to Roy Williams in 2000 and said, dude, it's your time. And Roy Williams said, no, right? He said no, maybe because although he'd done great at KU, they had won a national championship, but also because he was Elisha. And Dean Smith was Elijah. And he was like, I cannot possibly walk in his shoes. Nobody could. 3 years later, they come back to Roy Williams and they say, you got to come to North Carolina. This is his home, right? So by that point, he did. But he never replaced Dean Smith. Nobody could replace Dean Smith, even though he went on to break Dean Smith's records, and he went on to win 3 national championships at North Carolina compared to Dean Smith's 2. You still couldn't replace Dean Smith. So today, we come to the scripture, and it is an Elisha. It is Dean Smith and Roy Williams. It is this coach. As Dean Smith was to coaches, Elijah was to prophets. When we hear prophet and we think of Martin Luther King Jr. standing up to Bull Connor, standing up to Governor Wallace, standing up to some Southern segregationist and telling them how it's going to be, that was Dean Smith. That's who he was. That's who Elijah was. Elijah was kind of in the spirit of Moses. Remember the story? Moses standing up to Pharaoh, let my people go, and there's the competition between the 10 plagues, you know, the frogs and the locusts and the turning the river to blood and all of that. That's who Elijah was. Elijah, before we got the books of the Bible named for the prophets, was the one who stood up to Ahab and Queen Jezebel and said, my one holy, sweet God is going to challenge all your idols and your statues to Baal. And there was that competition, and Elijah won. That all sounds just kind of really weird to us, golden calves and statues. But then when I think about my own life, right, and the idols I have, I get up in the morning, I go out on my run, and for at least a few minutes, I think about this gift of this life. I think about this, whatever word you have for it, mystery, spirit, one, sweet one, creator, something beyond Holly that set this into motion, that created this world, that has called me to live in such a world, to try to live outside of myself, right? To give myself for others, to give myself for this creation. And for a little while I'm there, right? Before I slip into my idols. You've heard me talk about them. You know, one is just having enough money that nothing bad can ever happen. I think that's a worthwhile goal, right? I just want to have enough money so that my children and everybody I love can be completely protected and nothing bad can ever happen. But then I also, I'm sure, have some of the idol of I want people to think of me as a pastor who was better than average. That's certainly an idol I have, you know. And then I also have the idol of I don't want to look 61, you know, if I can pass for 58. So we have these idols, right? And then Elisha comes along, and what does Elijah do? Elijah smashes those idols. Elijah says, really? Do you really think do you really think that's how it works? You can just get yourself protected enough so that cancer won't come for you? No, 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 no. You've got to find a way to live in this world. And then in this passage this morning, you've got Elijah the prophet who is now going to hand it on to Elisha. And it's kind of a sweet little story. There's some miracles in there. There's the let's roll up our mantle and strike the water and it passes. You know, just like Moses, the people are going to go through the Jordan. And then there's the Elijah being carried up into the heavens in a chariot with horses. But the real miracle here that the narrator focuses on over and over and over again is the relationship between Elijah and Elisha, is this deep connection they feel. And we aren't told whether that's because they spent months together or years together. We know at some point Elijah had seen Elisha working in the field, and he threw his mantle over him and he called him to be his follower. But what we have here is really what scholars call a holy friendship, this holy connection. And if you think of some of your friendships, you know, like your closest, you know, and you just think there's, you know, when you're with someone and you just have this sense of, what an incredible gift it is to be with this person, that this person loves me and is with me and supports me. Or some scholars talk about it as what you call a servant, like servant leadership role, like somehow Elisha looks to Elijah and says, yeah, I don't want you to leave, I don't want you to leave. And Elijah looks at him and says, hey, what can I do for you? What can I do to support you? And Elisha says, give me a double portion of your spirit. You know, I want to be like you, only more so, right? And Elijah's like, okay, I'm good with that. If you see me going up into heaven, you'll get it. So there he is, he gets that. And it reminds me of a good friend of mine who's a pastor in Texas, and she is now doing a program in the city of Grapevine, Texas. And if you know anything about being a federal employee, state employee, city employee right now, it's all tough, right? Because you got a lot of people hammering on you. And this program is designed to take people who've got talent and ability, they sign up, they get chosen, and they need to do this 10-month program, and they're given a mentor. They're given someone who guides them. They're given someone who's unselfish enough to think, you're going to replace me at my job, and I'm going to try to teach you and offer you every single thing I can, which is exactly what Fiona Hill says in her book, There Is Nothing for You Here. I know Lori Taylor loves this book, and I know our book club read it. Fiona Hill grew up in northern England, extremely poor. Her father was a coal miner, born in the Depression. They lived in an abandoned building. He slept in a drawer in a chest. And she really had nothing. Her father told her, there's nothing for you here. And she was very bright, but she had that accent in England that kind of showed that she was poor, like low class. And she talked about how in England, class is to what race is here. It's really something that is used to keep people out. She was incredibly bright, so she managed somehow to go to Moscow to study, and then she came to Harvard, and then she became this expert in Russian public policy, and then she rose up into the national security apparatus. And if you saw her picture, you'd probably know her because she was one of the chief witnesses at President Trump's first impeachment trial. And in her book, she kind of goes on to talk about how it's really rare for someone to make it from the bottom to the top, right? It is really not a story that happens very often because there are so many structures that keep people out based on race, class, all kinds of isms. And at the end of the book, she has like 5 pages, and her answer is like, yeah, governments and institutions need to do more to kind of do more affirmative action, do more ways to kind of lift people up. But she's like, but it's on everybody. Her answer to the whole thing is mentoring. Every single person needs to be taking their portion and giving it to somebody else. She's like, if you're retired, you should be mentoring. You should be reading to somebody. If you're a head of a company or you work in an organization, you should make sure you've got internships for people who are too often left out. If you're a college administrator, you should be making sure that your classes are free to high school students who can't afford it. If you're a student yourself, you should be reading and teaching others. The whole thing is about mentoring. It's all about this kind of servant leadership. And it sounds like a really simplistic thing, but then when you stop and think about it, if you stop and think, what would it be like if instead of me thinking so much about, but I think my real role is what passing this on to those coming after me. My real role is trying to teach people behind me, beside me, next to me, how to do what I can do, but far better, right? How can we be so invested in reaching out to those around us? There's going to be a football game tonight, and one of the reasons the Chiefs is sort of America's team, I think we all know, is because of the relationships that we all see, whether you like to or not. Even if you don't want to see, you know, if you live in another football area, you can't help but see the holy friendship between Travis Kelce and Pat Mahomes, right? You see it on the TV. And you can't help but see the relationship between Andy Reid and the players. There's a playfulness. There's also a real seriousness. The guy's kind of businesslike. He's actually supposed to be a pretty good mentor. And then, of course, there's the relationship that a few people might know about between Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce, unless you have been just like in a coma for the last 5 months. But then my husband, who has had season tickets for the Chiefs for 36 years and knows everything about the Chiefs and is right now at Kelly's bar, zooming in, hey Joe, he told me that the most important relationship under all the relationships, and the reason that we are all here is because of the relationship between Alex Smith and Pat Mahomes. Alex Smith was a quarterback when Mahomes was drafted. Some of you know his story. Alex Smith was drafted. He was a first-round draft pick by the San Francisco 49ers in 2005. He came in there. He did a good job in 2012. He had a concussion. He lost his job. In 2013, the Chiefs picked him up. That was, shall we say, a low point for the Chiefs franchise. If you can remember, in 2012, the Chiefs won 2 games. They had 14 losses. They were also being sued. The front of the house was being sued in a very large age discrimination lawsuit, which they lost. And then there was the tragedy of the player who killed himself, killed his girlfriend and her child and himself in front of the Chiefs building. So it was a really low point for the Kansas City Chiefs. And then in 2013, they brought in Alex Smith, and Alex Smith took the Chiefs to the playoffs. He took the Chiefs to the playoffs 4 of the next 5 years. And then when he was 33, not washed up, in 2017, the Chiefs surprised him by drafting Pat Mahomes. And that was kind of a gut punch to Alex Smith, right? That was kind of a sign to him, you're done. And he kind of came up for air. He said his very first thought was, what the hell, right? And they said to him, we want you to stay around another year, and we want you to mentor Pat Mahomes. We want you to keep being the quarterback. We want you to teach him every single thing. We want you to give him every single shortcut. And he said, you bet. And he did it. Alex Smith stepped up to the plate. He took Pat Mahomes under his wing. He tried to teach him everything he had learned in 12 years so that Patrick Mahomes could be ready to step up and go. And nobody's been happier for Patrick Mahomes than Alex Smith. That was not the first time Alex Smith was replaced. In 2012, he had a bad concussion playing for the 49ers, and he was replaced by who? Colin Kaepernick. Many of you don't know anything about football, but you know Colin Kaepernick, right? Because Colin Kaepernick was the one in 2016, the quarterback who took a knee against police brutality, and did he pay for that or what, right? He lost not just his position at the 49ers, he lost his career. I mean, he was, to use the term, blackballed, right? He was just pushed completely out. And you know who stood up for Colin Kaepernick more than anybody else? Alex Smith. Alex Smith said, Nobody should be treated this way. Colin Kaepernick's an amazing quarterback. It's ridiculous. He should be able to speak up. He should be able to say what he believes. This is a free country. And then President Trump was elected, and Alex Smith showed up at the very first news conference in his jersey with a safety pin on it, because he'd seen it at his kids' school, right? It was a symbol. Teachers were wearing them as a way of saying to kids, you're safe. And Alex Smith stood up there and he said, it doesn't matter who you are or who you love or where you're from or who you worship. You should be safe and loved and treasured in this world. There's a word for that. Well, that's servant leadership, right? That's giving of yourself for others. None of us are Dean Smith. We're not Alex Smith. We're not Fiona Hill. We're really like the employees at the City of Grapevine. We're trying to do what we can do, right? We're trying to take this world a little bit further along. This is a good day to think about that. Transfiguration Sunday, Super Bowl Sunday, the day before we move into the season of Lent where we're talking about love builds up. To think about just what might I do to take whatever I have and give it out there to the world so that the day might come when it's not just wins and losses, but the true victory, right? Where there's no hurting or destroying on God's holy mountain, where the day comes where every single child is fed and free. May it be so. Amen.